Hi and welcome to ABACAST, our podcast for the Abacus group. And it's my very great pleasure today to welcome Jay Gomez, definitely a friend of the firm and a friend of ours. Star turn for our first podcast with an external guest. And of course, Julian, who's also joining us, Julian Pitaluga, who's joining us for the session today as well. Jay is the managing partner at Triay's law firm of recent elevation, so congratulations once again on your appointment. I hope it's going to work out really well for you.
Thank you.
No doubt it will. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you, and we are going to be talking about principally funds today, because that's the area that you both, I think it's fair to say, specialize in. And of course, we don't want to make this tutorial on funds, but we want to get to know as much as possible about the local regime and about the kind of conditions we are working in the funds area. But before we get into all that, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, what's the journey been so far, your background, why you took an interest in law, where you went to study it, that kind of stuff?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. In terms of my background, so a lawyer, I qualified in England and Wales in 2009, 2010, feels like an eternity now.
Wow, back, yeah.
And I then joined Triay here in Gibraltar, and I joined as an associate, worked within the financial services team, and then, as you said, recently became the managing partner of the firm. And I also head up the financial services team along with one of my colleagues.
Right. Before we kicked off, you were talking about family a little bit. Why don't you tell us
Yes.
a little bit about them?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have
What you
two
got?
young boys and a very understanding wife.
Excellent.
So it's always a bit of a balance, trying to balance work and family life, as many others do. All of that can be a challenge.
Yeah. Maybe we can come back to that part later on.
Sure.
But maybe we can just deep dive into funds from the off.
Mm-hmm.
The whole kind of esoteric world of funds and crypto and blockchain is something that's a mystery to a lot of people, particularly of my generation, I dare say. But before we get into the detail of that, what do you think, how would you position Gibraltar in the panoply of jurisdictions where funds is the kind of main animus of the jurisdiction? Luxembourg, Cayman, where does Gibraltar sit within that panoply of jurisdictions in your view?
So it's a question that we get asked quite a lot, as you can imagine, when prospective clients are looking at where to domicile their fund. They're obviously not just looking at Gibraltar, they're looking at places like Cayman and Luxembourg. And I think what I always say to them is that no jurisdiction is perfect. You're essentially looking at what jurisdiction works best for that particular client. And of course, places like Cayman can be convenient for clients that perhaps are on the other side of the world. Gibraltar tends to be very convenient for clients that are themselves based within the European continent. And that is just down to the practicalities, things like time zone. You then look at, or they would typically then look at what those jurisdictions within their sort of area of practicality provide the most efficient regime for them. And when it comes to Gibraltar, I'd probably highlight the speed to market as being a key factor for them to consider. And also, ironically, Brexit, one of the blessings of Brexit was how it's allowed us to differentiate ourselves from other European jurisdictions, like Luxembourg, for example, that you mentioned earlier. And I think I'm sure, no doubt, come on to some of the implications of Brexit later on.
Yes. We have talked in the past about how other jurisdictions, you mentioned speed to market. I mean, that's triggered a thought in my mind, because I've certainly had conversations with clients and other intermediaries who have, I'm not going to mention other names, but where the process is really slow, the regulator is very, very slow. It takes a long time to even have a dialogue, initiate a process. What are the aspects of the speed to market that make it work as well as it does in GIB?
So I think one of the main points is the fact that Gibraltar is a relatively small place. So that can help with the fact that everybody generally knows each other. That can help in streamlining the process for for clients. We're also very fortunate to have a regulator that's very engaging. So if one compares that to other jurisdictions, one might find that the regulators there may not be as engaging and take more of a distanced approach to the industry. The regulator here really gets involved at an industry level, likes to understand what's happening, and that then helps with the process for setup.
Yeah, I mean, I know for a fact from personal experience actually within our business that the regulators are rigorous, actually quite tough, whereas this idea, this notion of speed to market, because we've got a familiar regulator and we know each other, might give the impression of familiarity that actually I think is not necessarily helpful, because we kind of do want clients and prospects to think this is a proper process, it's absolutely rigorous, and they're going to be as demanding of us as they might be in any other territory. Would you say that that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one shouldn't confuse speed with a lack of regulatory powers. So it's all down to the legislative framework that we have in place. And we quite frequently refer to that as right touch regulation. Some jurisdictions have historically referred to the legislation as being light touch regulation. But here it's that right touch of regulation that ensures the regulator has the necessary powers in order to ensure that they can enforce should they need to. And that then leads to this really unique regime that we have to launch those experienced investor funds.
Yes. The word regime immediately brings to mind dual regime. What's the dual regime?
So the dual regime is something that has come about as a result of Brexit. So I think the fact that we left the EU, obviously when the UK did, meant that we then had some more flexibility in the regulations and the rules that we apply here in Gibraltar, where previously we had to comply with AIFMD, the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive. We now have a regime in place where experienced investor funds can opt out of those regulations when they don't intend to use that EU passport. I hope that's covered it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the benefits of one of the few benefits of Brexit. It's allowed us to reconsider what our position was in the market, and there was the decision taken to create this new dual regime, which allowed Gibraltar funds to opt out of the requirement of having to comply with that directive. And that opt-out is on the basis of the old legislative framework that Gibraltar had before the directive came into effect. So it's important to point out that opting out of the directive doesn't mean that no law applies. There is a set of legislation that predated the directive, which then kicks in essentially in order to make sure that those funds can continue operating.
And since the introduction of the regime, have you seen the benefits of it in practice, in progress?
Yeah, in particular I would say in the crypto and digital assets sector. So one of the issues with the directive in the context of crypto and digital assets is that it requires funds to have a depository, and that depository is responsible for the safekeeping of all of the assets of the fund. When one puts that in the context of a digital assets or crypto fund, and the requirements to have a specific type of depository, which is basically a bank, in order to set up a crypto fund which adheres to the directive, you need to try and find a bank that will not only custody cash, but will also custody crypto and digital assets. And that beast, if I can call it that, of a banking institution today doesn't exist. So it's almost impossible to set up a crypto fund with an AIFM depository in order to comply with the directive. So one of the beauty of the dual regime is that the minute you opt out of having to comply with the directive, you can set up the fund here in Gibraltar, you can appoint a normal bank to provide cash accounts and then have a separate entity that can custody the digital assets, and typically that would be an entity that's regulated in order to provide that service.
Right. As a legal expert in the funds area, I'm trying my best to avoid the cliche funds space. I can't stand the cliche. But in the funds arena, how do you think crypto and blockchain and that world is shaping the funds industry in Gibraltar more generally? Because we are one part of it with the funds administration bit, but you have, I guess, a more kind of global overview of the interlocking parts. So how do you think the new technologies are actually shaping the funds business in Gibraltar more generally?
So I think the first observation that I'd make, and I think this is a fair point to make, is that it's really positioned Gibraltar on a global scale. There's been publications that have ranked Gibraltar as the top jurisdiction on the European continent for these types of funds, and ranked it in second, third place, and on a global scale. And I don't think that's something that we've previously experienced as a jurisdiction for funds. So it has really positioned us on a global scale. It's also resulted in a large number of funds calling Gibraltar their home. So that has led to more funds under administration, more funds under management, and it's then fed into the growth of what I would call the surrounding industry. So your fund administrators, your auditors, all having more work as a result of that influx in crypto funds looking to domicile themselves here. The knock-on effect of that as well has been making sure that we can service those funds in the way that one would expect. So making sure that we upskill our staff to be able to deal with the nuances of that asset class, and some of those are very, very different to what we'd be used to in dealing with other asset classes, be them traditional funds that invest in vanilla strategies, or slightly more alternative funds that invest in things like real estate. The risks, etc., associated with crypto are very, very different. So making sure that everyone understands those has been a journey.
Do you think those risks are more significant than those present in traditional funds, and how would those risks be mitigated?
I wouldn't say more significant. I think when you have a particular asset class, there are risks associated with each of those asset classes. I don't think these are kind of more important or more problematic. Just the way that one addresses them is different. When we're looking at crypto funds and digital asset funds, a lot of the time, a lot of that risk is itself managed with technology. Technology that perhaps we might not have used before, or that people might not be very familiar with. So that in itself has been, I think, a learning curve for a lot of the service providers, and also for the managers themselves. So the profile of the managers typically that we are dealing with in that sector is a very different profile of manager to what we would see with vanilla asset classes. So typically these are individuals that themselves come from the tech space. So at times transitioning them into the world of corporate governance and the regulator sphere can be challenging. We're talking to them about concepts that they aren't necessarily familiar with. That in itself also poses an additional risk to the fund, that they themselves need to learn how to manage. And that in fairness, the industry bodies and the regulator, I think, has been very proactive in assisting the industry, in particular the industry bodies in delivering regular training for them has been very, very helpful.
Yeah, just rotating back to your comment about the rankings. Actually, I had a kind of similar thought when you mentioned that, because in the traditional area, it would be fairly easy to benchmark different businesses in terms of rankings, in terms of assets under management. But the first thing you think about in the crypto world is, well, how do you define assets under management? And when the panoply of different kinds of tokens and currencies is taken into account, how do you measure all of that? Is that a practical consideration when you look at those rankings, or am I just talking?
No, so the rankings do look at assets under management, even for the crypto space. I mean, ultimately, these digital assets have a value. Typically, there's a secondary market for them, and this would be the valuation on that secondary market that's used to determine what each fund's AUM, assets under management, would be. I don't know if Julian wants to add to that, given your more sort of practical day-to-day.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously that there is a valuation risk that comes with crypto funds, which we haven't spoken about yet, which is, that they are a new asset class. The volume and the trading volume, the liquidity is not the same as the traditional asset classes. So those assets do become harder to value, and especially when you're talking about illiquid coins that are perhaps very thinly traded or not even traded at all. I mean, we can go even a step further beyond that and look at instruments where there isn't even a token yet, what we refer to as soft agreements, so simple agreements for future tokens.
Must drive auditors nuts. No? Must be baffling for them to some degree, I guess. But
yeah, I think it's been, as we were saying before, right? It's been a bit of a learning curve for everyone involved, all of the sort of service providers that surround this industry. But the industry has matured a lot. If I look back even 5 years ago, there's been a massive change. And the truth is that even the secondary markets where those digital assets are listed have themselves also come a long way. So whilst that risk still does exist, I think we're not dealing with the same level of risk that we were dealing with 5 years ago.
Yes, it's kind of moving in from left, isn't it? Yeah. I think one of the most welcome things for me of these developments actually has been the extent to which our firms are collaborating and have collaborated on this kind of work. I dare say it's kind of rejuvenated Abacus to some degree, and I imagine it's done the same, not just because you guys are younger than us, but that it's done the same for Triay too. I imagine that life at Triay has taken on a different kind of perspective based on your involvement in this area of work.
Yeah, I can still remember the days of discussing within the firm whether or not we should start servicing clients in this sector, and I think the partners at the time took a decision really, which obviously came with its own elements of risk, but I think that was the right decision given the way that the industry was moving and also how Gibraltar was moving as a jurisdiction to proactively regulate and service that industry. And the truth is, if we look now at the number of investment funds domiciled in Gibraltar, a large chunk of them invest in digital assets. And we've seen other more traditional sort of financial services institutions themselves also move into the sector, and family offices moving into the sector and also investing. So yes, it has changed the dynamic of the type of work that we do quite substantially.
Yeah, and you're right. I think the investment that we've had to make on our side in terms of the technology that we use to service the clients, the upskilling of the staff to make sure that they're on point with all the kind of latest developments, I think it's an investment that you consciously need to make, but that to date I think has yielded results. I mean, we quite clearly are seeing some very good progress in the business in our area. There's a kind of global focus on tokenization. That's a long word. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what that means? What is tokenization?
So I'll break it down into what I think are two main pillars of what tokenization are. in the context of investment funds. So the first one is the tokenization of the fund itself. So can we take a unit, a participation in the fund, and tokenize that in a way that is on blockchain? And that aspect of tokenization clashes with some elements of traditional financial services law. And when I refer to traditional financial services law, I'm talking of things like the requirement to issue a prospectus, what happens then when you tokenize, and that now digital asset on the blockchain is potentially freely transferable. Most funds, unless they're listed, have a register of investors that is controlled by the fund, and the transfer of those shares are controlled by the fund. The minute you tokenize, you lose that element of control. So there are still those hurdles to overcome. I think it's safe to say that no jurisdiction has yet entirely fixed the problem. I'm pleased to say that there's a working group here in Gibraltar that I think are getting pretty close to fixing it. And then once one tokenizes, then it opens a question of, well, do you want to list that token, and do you list on a traditional listing venue, because ultimately is that token a unit of participation in the fund, or do you list on a crypto type exchange, which is not really intended for that type of participation and that type of listing? The second part of it is the tokenization of what the fund might invest in. So the tokenization of its assets, and can it invest in those tokenized digital assets? And those we've seen lots of. There's people out there trying to tokenize everything, and that also has its complications. The kind of joining up of the real world with the digital world has its issues.
And I guess that must have implications for fund administrators, because as you're trying to map out evaluation, the kind of difficulties that Jay's addressing must imply some difficulties for you guys.
I've already spoken about the valuation risk, I think, in respect of the tokenized assets within the fund. But I think obviously tokenizing the fund shares presents other types of challenges. And I think really they stem from regulatory hurdles more than anything else. But something like, as Jay mentioned, if those tokens are freely transferable on other marketplaces, then how, as the regulated service provider, do we get comfort over KYC, due diligence information on where those tokens are being sent to, and who where they're going from, who they're being sent to. So I think there are other challenges that come in dealing with tokenized fund shares as opposed to the tokenized assets held by the fund.
It presents a whole new element of risk that needs to be managed and potentially mitigated. So you're looking at risk from the technology's perspective, so that would generally be the same type of risk associated with investing in digital assets. So, is the technology safe? Can the technology fail? But also the risk of things like Julian was mentioning of due diligence on the investors. So if the tokens are freely transferable, how do you know at any one point in time who's owning what, other than the record on the blockchain?
Sanctions, for example, how can you comply with sanctions regulations?
Yeah. In fact, that's what I was just thinking. The kind of challenges that must pose for a regulator or someone giving an assurance, like an auditor, must be enormous.
I think for the auditors, it's probably more of an issue as to what the underlying assets themselves are. But of course, they'll ultimately be concerned as well with who owns the units of participation, I guess, as part of their general audit of the fund itself. I think that the main issue is the issue of transferability of those tokens, or their free transferability. And really, until until one has a secondary market for the tokenization of those participations in the fund, which ensures that anyone transferring the tokens has met a certain requirement, i.e., that a participant on the exchange isn't on a sanctions list, then
or
you
qualifies under the experienced investor fund criteria, for example.
Then you can start to get a little bit more comfortable, and you've started to mitigate some of the risk associated with the transferability of those tokens. And if we draw an analogy with the traditional financial services world, it would be inconceivable today to think that in respect of a normal listed equity, that you might have somebody accessing a stock exchange and purchasing shares on a stock exchange if they are on a sanctions list. So there would be an element of control to prevent that. Either the exchange themselves, if it's an exchange that allows individuals to access the exchange directly, would be doing due diligence on that individual, or the broker that's giving that person, that's purchasing the stock on behalf of that person, will have done due diligence on that individual. So the companies whose shares are being brought has mitigated that risk because of those controls that are there. That doesn't yet completely exist for the tokenization of funds, but the tokenization really of any type of security, because the exchanges, I don't think, are quite there yet. You almost have the sort of crypto exchanges who are focused on the listing of digital assets, and then you have the traditional exchanges that are concentrating on what they've always done. But I don't think there's anyone that's really merged the two of them in a way that provides that level of comfort that would be required.
Yeah. Just pulling back from, this is a very niche point being discussed by two experts in the field. I'm not sure how much of our audience is going to be able to worry about the implications of that, but just pulling back from all of that, more generally, how do you think the kind of people who are involved in this world and who want to bring their funds to Gibraltar are going to be picking up on that kind of detail, or are they going to be just more focused on where can I get a good service provider, what's available to me, how can I get the mechanics of this going? And therefore, we've already talked about the regulatory attractiveness of Gibraltar, but perhaps you can talk a little bit about the commercial side of it and why we are an attractive commercial proposition to a prospect.
So I think it's a good question, and typically the fund manager wouldn't be an expert on all of the things that we've been talking about. Their expertise, one would hope, is in actually managing the investments themselves. Not necessarily an expert in structuring or all the other things that we've spoken about. And that's really then down to the service providers, so us, the fund administrators, the auditors, to really guide them through that process, both during the establishment process, but then during the life of the fund. Most fund managers as well choose to appoint non-executive directors. In the context of our experienced investor fund, it's actually a requirement to have what we call EIF, Director, Experienced Investor Fund Directors, who are, for all intents and purposes, non-executive directors. Those individuals, because of the nature of the service that they provide, also have a good understanding of the type of things that I, as a lawyer, would be flagging to the client, because they've probably heard me talk about it before in the context of other funds. They would have also dealt with the fund administrators in other contexts on other funds, and similarly with the auditors. So really all of those service providers coming together provide that level of support, I think, that the manager needs when they're looking to set up a fund, and like I said, during the lifetime of it as well.
Thanks. Just moving on a little bit to the next flavor of the month topic, which of course is going to be AI. And a lot of my contemporaries are looking at their WhatsApp groups and seeing this little circle at the bottom of their kind of chat and saying, what's this for? Can we talk a little bit about AI and the kind of implications that's going to have right across the piece for our jurisdiction, for the business you're involved in, for our firms, for our staff? Where do we start with all that?
So I think it's still quite early days in the context of how is AI really going to have an impact on our industry and what we do on a day-to-day basis. I think a lot of regulators and policymakers are still grappling with how do we regulate this in a way that we make it safe for the average person. In the context of funds, I think we will likely see it assisting in things like, we've discussed at quite some depth, risk management. I think we'll see artificial intelligence being used for risk management to help managers and also the service providers that surround them managing risk. I'm not so sure that we're going to see a mass influx of investment into artificial intelligence, at least not in its current form. I think there are, it's already become quite a niche market. So I'm not seeing the influx of funds or managers rather coming to us and saying, I want to set up a fund to invest into artificial intelligence in the same way that we saw that with digital assets.
I think it's more that it's going to enable us to use tools and find efficiencies that we weren't able to before, whether that's in risk management, as you say, or corporate governance, even reviewing documents. Obviously having a personal touch is always important, but I think it's going to enable us to find those efficiencies that we didn't have before. Just as an example, I've been using AI to build a crypto portfolio tracking app, which I'm hoping to deploy across our crypto clients. And that is, simply prompt-based with very little knowledge of coding, and it does all the heavy lifting for you. Obviously there has to be some review process to that, but that's just one example of how we're merging that new technology into what we currently do.
Yeah. In terms of our own businesses, it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how it does infiltrate, I think, into what we do, and we're already seeing it. I think from a management perspective, it's important to understand, again, what the risks are of using it. If a member of staff is using AI, how is that information, that data that the employee is plugging into it, where is that going to? How is it being used? Yes. And what risk does that generate for us as a business? From our perspective, I think we're quite fortunate because within our group, one of the CEOs is I've known for many years, joined us fairly recently. He comes from the tech world and used to talk to me about AI about 10-15 years ago, and I used to think, this guy's crazy, what's he talking about? And he's now going through the process of implementing AI into some of our processes. We're looking at it slightly differently from the perspective that you are, because I think our businesses are very different. We're looking at it from how can this help in things like client onboarding, a process which historically is quite dated, asking people for copies of their passport, which we then plug, and also quite manual, which we then plug into a different system to give us a result on their passport. Manually checking against sanctions lists, manually checking for adverse media. How can we use AI to help us streamline all of that process? Perhaps a role that somebody might have, or a task that somebody might have done previously that might have taken them 15-20 minutes to do, can we use artificial intelligence to do that in a much more efficient way? Which then raises the moral question of how is it going to impact on jobs? And I think that's one that we're all still grappling with. I don't think we're going to see, I think I'm obviously too young to have been there at the time, but I guess it must have been the same thing that people were thinking when computers started making their way into offices.
Yeah.
Is this going to get rid of people?
Very much so.
And I don't think we're going to see that. I think what will happen instead is that we're going to see a change in the role of the individuals within the organization. So using the example of client onboarding, somebody is still going to have to check whatever it is that artificial intelligence produces. To check that it's correct, but also to make a final decision on it. We're not going to rely on AI to make that decision for us. So I think just roles will change as opposed to eliminating roles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's helpfully reassuring because right now, from my perspective, AI feels like getting someone else to do your homework. It's like it's that sensation that you're not quite doing something right or morally correct. But of course, it is a tool. We just have to learn how to adapt and use the tool going forward. Just to ask a banal question: what is Agentic AI? Am I even pronouncing it correctly?
So Agentic AI, my understanding is when the artificial intelligence can actually carry out tasks for you. So, for example, you might have heard of ChatGPT and other kind of language-based models. That's very much, you typing in a question and it researching, getting you an answer, whether it's providing a code snippet or whatever it might be. Agentic AI is now taking that a step further and actually performing tasks for you. So, for example, you might think of the example of coming up with a holiday itinerary, which you can ask ChatGPT or any other AI software to do for you. But the next step would then actually be looking at the hotels, making the reservations, booking your car hire, etc., 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 and getting the whole package done for you. So that is the next step in terms of Agentic AI. It becomes an agent for you.
Yeah. The ultimate goal surely must be to try and get AI to predict the questions that I should be asking, but that I'm not asking. I don't know if that's ever going to be possible. Maybe I can ask you to kind of take over this part of the conversation in relation to the variety of fund structures that we have in Gibraltar, because it's an area that I just don't cover at all. And there are a number of these fund structures that we've used, that we've adopted. Some are quite innovative, some are quite historical.
Yeah.
Do you want to kick off a little discussion on that, and then maybe ask Jay what's relevant to?
Sure. So I think, as you mentioned, we do have a variety of fund structures that we can utilize in Gibraltar, be they for private funds or experienced investor funds. One of the more kind of novel structures that we've introduced is the protected cell limited partnership. Now, a limited partnership is quite a normal type of structure that is used for funds worldwide, but I think the protected cell limited partnership is quite unique to Gibraltar. So maybe you want to touch on what a protected cell limited partnership is.
It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? I mean, PCLP, protected cell. Yeah.
It is a bit of a mouthful, and getting to the point of having the legislation finalised was also a bit of a challenge. So I think to start off with answering that question, I'd probably answer it in the exact same way as I answered the first question that Chris asked me, in that there's no perfect structure for everyone, right? So you need to have a suite of structures that are able to meet the needs of every particular, or as much as possible, every client. So the kind of structures that everyone is used to when setting up a fund, the vehicle would be a limited company or a limited partnership. We embarked on a journey about 4 or 5 years ago now in making sure that our limited partnership legislation was the best in class. And to do that, the Gibraltar Funds and Investments Association, which is the main industry body in Gibraltar that represents the sector, worked very, very closely with HM Government of Gibraltar to achieve that. And that legislation considered limited partnership legislation in a number of jurisdictions, in particular those jurisdictions that we felt had good limited partnership legislation. We cherry-picked what we thought were the best parts and then brought it all together in the limited partnership legislation. So limited partnership legislation today I believe is one of the best ones in the world. In 2001, I think from memory, the Protected Cell Companies legislation was brought into life. So I'll abbreviate that as the PCC legislation. The PCC legislation allowed the establishment of a legal entity with the ability to create cells within it for the segregation of assets and liabilities. So that is a vehicle that is available for the use in an experienced investor fund. When we were working on the limited partnership legislation, it occurred to us that perhaps we should look at creating a limited partnership vehicle that also allows you to segregate assets and liabilities in the same way as the PCC does. So that is really where the PCLP legislation was then born. And there are a few funds domiciled in Gibraltar that have taken advantage of that legislation. And the concept is exactly the same as for a PCC. So in that sense, we weren't reinventing the wheel, although it does sound like a mouthful.
Yeah.
The basis of it was already there from the Protected Cell Company legislation. And what it essentially allows the partnership to do is to set up sub-funds for the purposes of segregating assets and liabilities, which is a concept that's been there for many years, both in the context of our own PCC legislation, but also there are many other jurisdictions in the world that have legislation that's similar to our PCC legislation. So this isn't something that's remarkably new, or the concept of segregation of assets isn't something that's remarkably new. It's something that has been tested and used before. However, it is new in the context of limited partnerships. So I think that is something that really distinguishes and makes Gibraltar quite unique. And I know that other jurisdictions were looking to see how they could replicate what we had done. And I think is always satisfying to see that other jurisdictions are trying to replicate
copycat,
what we've done.
Yeah, so I'm aware that the PCC is very similar to the Cayman SPC, Segregated Portfolio Company. But I'm not aware that Cayman, for example, have similar legislation in respect of their partnerships. So I guess it is a unique proposition for Gibraltar.
Yeah, and the thinking there was because I think a lot of the times when we were discussing with clients the use of a protected cell company, we were also talking to them about the use of a limited partnership. And that was typically driven because for some categories of investors, investing via a limited partnership can be more tax efficient for them as individuals. So we were saying to them, we can set up a PCC for you, which is a company, so your investor would own shares in the PCC, or we can set it up for you as a partnership. And they were saying to us, well, why can't we set it up as a partnership so that the investor gets the tax benefit of investing in a partnership, or the tax advantage rather, investing in a partnership, but also segregate assets and liabilities. And I think that's when we realized there was a gap in the market that needed to be filled. And thankfully, that is a good example of the industry, the government and the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission coming together to try and produce a good outcome for everyone involved. And I think this also feeds into your question earlier as, what is one of the unique elements of Gibraltar is I think this closeness produces those real results for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, we were talking about PCLPs, PCLPs, and it prompted two thoughts in my mind. The first one is just to ask a little bit more about what are the standard types of structure you would use, very briefly. What are the standard types of structure you would use in GIB? So you've got your ordinary limited company for a private fund. Give us.
So if we're looking at a private fund, it tends to be either a limited company or a limited partnership. If we're looking at an experienced investor fund, then it ranges really. It can be a limited company, a protected cell company, a limited partnership, a protected cell limited partnership, the legislation also allows the use of trusts, although very, very rare. But in other jurisdictions, it can be quite common. I think here it's just less common because there's no real. So a lot of the structuring in other jurisdictions is typically driven by tax advantages of using a particular structure over another. Because the Gibraltar tax system is so benign, it really doesn't impact what kind of structure we use.
Yes. In fact, we haven't touched on tax at all, really, in what has been a fascinating discussion.
Do we have to?
Well, no. I mean, I don't want to go down that little rabbit hole, but I think we do need to kind of put on the table the fact what you just said, which is that there's a very benign tax backdrop to all this stuff, and of course, clients, prospects need to be looking into that. But I think for the purposes of this podcast, I think it's just safe to say that it is benign, and come and talk to us. But you probably find that you've got the right answers, or at least the answers that you want if you talk to the right people.
Yeah, I think the point I made there, Chris, is that when you're looking at a jurisdiction to structure fund, there's an assumption that the fund itself isn't going to be taxed. Otherwise, you'd look at doing it somewhere else.
Yeah. I think talk of PCCs has prompted in my mind what I think is the final question for today, which is, I think there's a segue, which is that possibly the elephant in the room is, what do we need to do to be attracting the big institutional funds to Gibraltar, where, again, in my banking days, you'd look at these things and they would be segregated cells in a mutual fund, and you'd have very clear different asset classes, different managers looking after each of those, but at an institutional level. And I'm not sure that we're seeing that phenomenon yet in Gibraltar. So really, it's almost a bit of a challenge for you guys as to how do we get from where we are now to drawing that kind of client to Gib?
It's a very good question, and one that I wish I had an answer to, that I could say with certainty this is exactly why there isn't a massive fund manager with a fund domicile here. What I put it down to is herd mentality and familiarity. So I think breaking the herd mentality of a particular fund management group, of telling them stop going or doing what you've always been doing and set up somewhere else, is really, really challenging, because that's what they're used to. If they've been domiciling in a particular jurisdiction, then that's what they'll be used to doing. And unless something happens in that jurisdiction that they perceive to no longer be fit for them, it's hard to stop them from, or to suggest to them that they should stop making that decision that they've always made. And the familiarity point is linked to that, but it's a slightly different point in that getting them to move away to something new requires them to become familiar with the new thing, with Gibraltar. And I think as humans, we naturally tend to be lazy. So asking somebody to spend time looking at something new when what they're already using in their mind already works is also a big challenge. So I don't know, maybe back to your AI point, maybe AI will fix this and we'll do the job for them.
Yes, I mean, we might not use this particular point that I'm about to make in the podcast. It's up to these guys whether we do or not. But I think what we're talking about is really having a kind of Victor Chandler moment, isn't it? Where suddenly one guy says, I'm going to use that place. And I think it's great. And then the bandwagon starts rolling and suddenly everyone in the gaming industry wants to be here. I don't know if that's a fair comparison or indeed that I'm making the point in the right way. But that's the way I kind of, it just needs that, not necessarily the one guy, but someone who will turn that corner that will say, yes, this place is well established enough and has the capacity and the resources and the talent to be able to do this for me.
Yeah, like there are some big funds domicile here in Gibraltar, and the managers are here as well. So there is already an element of that. I think it's just that when we think of fund management, we think of much larger groups, and breaking that herd mentality, as I was saying before, is difficult. Ironically, it's something that we haven't seen in the digital space. So when it comes to crypto funds and digital asset funds, the big ones are here. And they've come here because Gibraltar was proactive in the way that it sought to regulate that industry. Ironically, not so much from the funds side of view, because the legislation was already there, but just as a jurisdiction, we were proactive in regulating and welcoming anyone in the sector generally. So there was this kind of general assumption Gibraltar is crypto friendly, blockchain friendly, it therefore makes sense to domicile a fund there. And it just so happened that we had the funds regimes already there in order to be able to provide that product for them. So there was no need to break that herd mentality. They came here first, and in fact, I think what we're now finding is that other jurisdictions are trying to keep up with what Gibraltar is doing in the context of crypto funds. But looking at traditional asset classes, it is very much breaking that herd mentality, which is really, really
big
tough.
Challenge. Yeah.
I think the gambling analogy that you use is a good one, because it's very similar to what happened with crypto and digital assets, in that there was really no regulatory regime that offered what Gibraltar could offer. So by creating the regulatory regime for the online gambling, or at the time the remote gambling industry, it meant that suddenly the big players started to drift towards Gibraltar. And what happened in the crypto and digital asset space was very, very similar.
Well, that's a great way to end our podcast. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks, guys, for your contribution. Thanks, Jay, for being
Pleasure.
our guest.
Thank you.
It's been so interesting. Wish you all the best. There's almost like a kind of generational shift happening here. So the baton has passed to you. And I wish you well, especially at Triay. It's such a great firm that we've dealt with for so long. We wish you every success in your new role there.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah, thank you.